a non-equilibrium change. So it's an unusual kind of a force. The Russians find that when they, well, I'll give you an example in a second here. What Kozyrev found is that if you take a cotton swab and dip it into acetone and then let the acetone evaporate, that's what the physicists call a non-equilibrium process. Entropy is increasing as the evaporation is occurring. That actually causes a torsion force. If you put it near a pointer on a stick that can rotate, the stick actually is repelled by the force. It's a pushing force. And what he found that corresponds to what he called right-handed torsion. It's what the Chinese would call one of the polarities of qi. The Russians found that these two polarities, left and right-handed torsion, correspond to the Chinese version of yin and yang qi. What the Russians have found is that particular types of processes, like evaporating acetone, a dying plant, melting of ice, a chemical reaction, or sugar dissolving, all of these produce one polarity of this torsion. Kozyrev said it emits time. It corresponds to what we would call right-handed torsion, which is the pushing form. The Russians found that the other type of process, stretching rubber bands, a healthy growing plant, ice freezing, or a compressed spring, has the opposite effect. Kozyrev said this absorbs time. That produces left-handed torsion. This acts like dark matter. The first type acts like dark energy. So the Russians are really rediscovering in the lab the things our astrophysicists discovered in their telescopes, which is the dark energy and dark matter. But because these are laboratory experiments, they know a lot more about them. They can say a lot more about them and develop real theories of them. When a Qigong master wishes to push something away, he uses the right-handed torsion, the yang qi. When he wants to pull something, he uses the left-handed torsion. A lot of amazing experiments have been done with this energy. And one of the things that has been found is this energy can change the mass of things. It can change how much something weighs. You can make it weigh more or weigh less than it normally would weigh. So if you're a yogi and you want to levitate, then what you want to do is build up the right-handed qi in your body, and that'll make you lighter, cause you to repel gravity, and would actually levitate by this principle. Here's some experiments done by the Russians which show the changing mass of an object when this type of energy is present. One of the remarkable experiments that the Russians have done involves using a telescope, a reflector telescope, a parabolic reflector. You aim it at the sun, and you, at the focal point of your mirror, you put a special kind of detector that detects torsion. Over the front of the telescope, you put a metal plate. You stop any kind of conventional light or energy from coming in, they still are able to measure the torsion energy from the sun. But they found something unusual. They found the sun appears not just in one place in the sky. Normally, when you look up in the sky, you see the sun in a certain direction. That's where the sun was when the light was emitted. It took 8.3 minutes for it to get from there to here, so you're seeing the sun where it was 8.3 minutes ago. What the Russians found is they got 3 spots. The sun appeared in 3 places. One at that location, 8.3 minutes ago, another one where the sun is instantaneously right now, as though whatever they're measuring is traveling at infinite speed. And they get a 3rd bright spot at where the sun's going to be 8.3 minutes after that. In other words, they're looking at a signal as though it came from the sun backwards in time to here. So they actually get 3 images of the sun, 3 different propagation speeds, one of them backwards in time from there to here. why that's exciting for people trying to understand psychic processes is this force appears to have the right kinds of properties to understand how you can look into the future. How, when you're doing remote viewing, you can send a signal or receive a signal from the future or from the past. There are numerous healing experiments that have been done where the healer will send the healing to be received by someone at another time, not right now, but 2 weeks ago or 2 weeks into the future. This type of time shifting, which is totally unlike the forces we know about in Western physics, but this torsion appears to be able to explain those things. So it may be the key to understanding psychic phenomena and healing phenomena, PK, a lot of the puzzles that we can't explain in Western physics. The Russians have gone a lot further than that over the last several decades. This is a signal generator using torsion, which is pretty handy because you have a signal here that travels faster than light. It travels much faster than light for some situations. And this device can be modulated by signals and then sending a torsion wave through waveguides or through the air. This is just some of the Tomsk University data. It's been applied to metallurgy. It changes how crystals structure, how metals crystallize when they're cooling off. Some people are using devices based on torsion in alternative medicine, energy healing. As a scientist, what's really interesting is this is a glimpse into things at a much smaller scale than Western physics normally thinks about. The Planck scale is called the smallest scale that Western physics is able to say anything meaningful about. It's 20 orders of magnitude smaller. Are we up? Time up? 10 minutes? What is that? 20 minutes. Oh. Do I have to? Okay, the rest will be in sign language. Okay, so there's 20 orders of magnitude. That is 10 with 20 zeros after it. If you start from the size of an atom and go smaller and smaller and smaller, 10 to the 20th times smaller is where the Planck scale is. There's a huge amount of real estate in there, very, very small things that our Western science doesn't know anything about, and that's where unified field theory, where string theory to start with, but unified field theory, hopefully can go to be able to explain what happens at these smaller and smaller scales. Well, that appears to be the regime where torsion is really important. So it may be that this force that the Russians have discovered really can tell us a lot about what goes on at those small scales. The Western picture is that if you had a very powerful microscope and you could look down in very small dimensions and look at an electron, what it may be appearing to be sitting still, but really it's zigzagging around. It's being bombarded by energy from all sides, and it's zigging and zagging and going back and forth. And it looks kind of like this picture. And this is called the Zitterbewegung, or the random walk that electrons go through. And it appears as though maybe its torsion plays a role. It's not just photons, but maybe torsion is causing some of this wiggling that it goes through. If that's true, then it gives us some clues on how to build torsion into a better model of physics. I'm going to try to skip through some of this stuff here. In my first book, the last chapter, I talk about the beginnings of a theory, of how we could explain the paranormal phenomena, like remote viewing and out-of-body and teleportation and things like that, with a theory that's not Western science, but it's an extension built on Western science and taking it a little further so we can include the effects of consciousness and the effects of the paranormal. So my first book has a chapter like that. The second book, I go quite a bit further and include the life force in there as well and show how that can also be explained. But it's important, first of all, to just make a little comment that Einstein said that if we knew what we were doing, it wouldn't be called research, would it? So we're doing our best here with some ideas, and intuition to sketch out what might be a viable way to build a science. It's not a finished theory, it's certainly not a proven theory. These are some ideas on how we might be able to proceed. If they're right, then maybe there might be some ways we can use some of these ideas in experiments or in inventions as well. Einstein was very fond of using imagination and intuition in his research. Here's a thought experiment he did, sitting on a beam of light, which he imagined, and he came up with special relativity from this thought experiment by imagining how the world around him would look traveling at a very, very high rate of speed. If you take a picture like that, the electron can be thought of as something zigging and zagging around in a random walk in both space and time. One of the discoveries of modern physics is that particles travel backwards in time some of the time, and then forward in time some of the time. On the average, they're going forward in time, but they're really going both directions. This is sort of Feynman's picture of how things behave at very small scales. This is a sketch of some of the present models describing particle behavior at these small scales. One of the approaches I like has been developed by Bernard Hayes, Hal Puthoff, and some other scientists, where they try to take our current Western science and kind of look under the hood. In our current Western picture, a lot of things are concealed. We have a quantum physics rules, but nobody tries to explain why it should be the way it is. These scientists, I think, are much more interested in consciousness, and they realize if we're ever going to be able to understand consciousness, we have to look under the hood and look more detailed at why it is things behave the way they do. And there's a dynamics that's present. So that model is called statistical electrodynamics, or SED, and it's a little bit more detailed in terms of why things behave the way they do. And I like that approach, and I think all they have to do is add torsion to it. You'll have probably a much better model. But in either case, you're trying to explain the fabric of space-time. As I said before, Einstein talked about space as being able to curve, and this curvature gives rise to forces. If you think about that fabric as being made of fibers like a cloth, and those fibers are actually the torsion particles, the photons, then that's a pretty good picture, I think, that incorporates the Russian torsion work as well. I'm sorry, I'm running out of water. It's getting very dry here. So this model also assumes that anything local is also interacting with things far away. They're exchanging these photons, these torsion particles, over very large distances. So things that happen far away still are important to things that are happening close by. I explain in the book why this actually makes some sense. I won't go into that much here. The only important, it tries to picture everything at a deeper level, at a more detailed level than current Western science does. One of the keys to torsion is because it has this component that travels backwards in time, as well as one that goes forwards in time, it makes something possible that Richard Feynman and John Wheeler speculated about in 1945 in a well-known paper. They were both trying to go back to this idea of Mach's principle, how things that are far away could be important to what's happening locally. And normally the problem is, if something's far away, it takes a very long time for any signal to get there, and then a long time for any signal to get back here. So how can anything very far away have any influence on things that are nearby? John Wheeler and Richard Feynman said, well, suppose the photon can travel backwards in time as well as forwards in time. Then if you have an electron that's wiggling here, it sends off a photon that goes off into space and travels, billions of light years until it hits the distant matter, the stars that are far away, and it makes them wiggle. But if it makes a wave that also goes backwards in time, then that wiggling electron way out there could send a signal backwards in time. If it's coming backwards in time, then it comes this way, it takes 10 billion negative years, which means it gets here just about the same time the first one went out. So the round trip takes almost no time at all if you can go backwards in time as well as forwards. That was what they proposed in 1945, and that's, although no one really has any evidence that photons do that, we do know that the phitons do that, these torsion waves. So it looks like torsion is the perfect force to make this connection, to connect us to distant matter, and to show why there's this interaction going on that, and why distant things can affect us, even right when they're happening, right now. So that's the interesting and kind of exciting idea, and that leads to this idea of a synchronized universe. If you have a particle that's moving in a certain way and it's zipping around, there's a reason, and that's described in the book. The particle basically, because it's moving so fast, it travels at the speed of light, it only sees things that are straight ahead. It has tunnel vision. This is a relativistic effect. It only sees things that it happens to be traveling toward at that moment. So it can interact with a particle that's straight ahead at that moment. And likewise, the one out there only can interact with this one if it's aiming right at this one at that moment. So two particles, when they're lined up, can interact. Other particles they won't see. So if you have particles that are orbiting together, that are synchronized, then it's possible to synchronize and line up these effects so particles interact with other particles, even over great distances, as long as they're moving in a synchronous way. Thank you. So it leads to the idea that you can have a system of these particles that are all moving synchronously together. They'll see each other. They'll say, you're real, I'm real, we're matter, we're real stuff, you know, because we feel forces on each other. You can have other particles traveling in a different phase, a different frequency. You won't see them. They'll be there, but because they're out of phase and they're not aimed the right direction at the right time, you won't feel the effects. They'll be invisible to you. So it's a little bit like the fan that's turning. You have a strobe light flashing on it. If the strobe frequency matches the turning of the fan, the blades will appear to be solid, and they'll appear to be, you know, to stop, basically. But if the flashing frequency of the strobe does not match the fan, the blades disappear. They're not synchronized. So that's kind of the idea of this model. And it leads to the prediction that our reality is really the particles that are synchronized with us. You could have other synchronized planes of reality that are present right here in this room, but they're synchronized differently. You won't see them. You'll feel random effects from them, but you won't feel anything that's a real force. So it's possible by this to have many parallel universes. And you're only really conscious of and detecting one, but they're all present. If you shift your phase or shift your frequency, then you'll be able to see one of the other ones. And when I proposed this in the first book, I thought, well, this is a natural prediction, and it helps explain some things, like how people pass through walls, things like that. But I never really expected that I would get any evidence that it was actually real. Since then, I've been amazed at the number of examples that have come up where these types of things actually seem to happen. So that's a whole other discussion. Where this might be important is in terms of consciousness, because we process things in our mind in terms of deciding something's real is limited by certain processing frequencies in the brain, such as the gamma frequency of about 40 hertz or so, where we decide, okay, we put things together and we conclude something's real. So there's a kind of a bandwidth in terms of how our brain processes the data to make decisions about what's real, what's external reality. And 40 hertz kind of comes up as one of those key numbers. So it makes you wonder, because in this set of sheets of layers of parallel realities, there's a frequency difference between layers, and it kind of makes me wonder, well, maybe that frequency difference has something to do with 40 hertz. That's a wild speculation at this point, but the reality that we are aware of is the reality that we are synchronized with. Our consciousness is synchronized with these particles that we say are real. So there's a synchronization that the mind is actually tied in with our perception of reality. So it might turn out to be something important. In this model, if you're in a different layer, a different sheet in a stack of sheets of realities, it would be just, you would not be aware of the presence of that other layer. In fact, one possibility is that what we call quantum noise, what we call the uncertainty principle, that extra noise that makes it hard to predict things in quantum physics, that might be the effect of the other parallel realities that are all present. They're all out of phase with each other. To us, in our own synchronized reality, it looks like noise. So it's a possibility. There's more to this model. One of the keys is that it's the distant matter, the pattern of motion, the pattern of ripples and disturbances on the distant matter that plays an important part in anything that we would call a solid particle. At this point, I'm probably just going to skip ahead, I think, here. But it's in the book, if you're interested. Our mind plays a very important role in how we perceive reality and how we can affect reality. Because our mind is a coherent process. Our mind involves DNA and other chemicals that are interacting with each other, and they act like oscillators. They're able to couple in with external particles and perceive reality in a certain way. So that I'm going to have to skip part of this here. In terms of understanding higher dimensions, I talk about how you would make matter that corresponds to higher dimensions. There are a number of predictions of this model. It can explain some of the things that are otherwise puzzling, how manifesting works, why biorhythms end up being correlated between the sender and the receiver when healers are working. This is a little picture that kind of shows the idea both for remote viewing as well as for ESP, as well as psychokinesis. Basically you have an observer and you have a target on the other side, and you're sending waves both into the future and into the past. Distant matter is reflecting them and then refocusing them. And in this way, you can make contact with things at great distance without losing energy. One of the puzzles, if it's any kind of conventional form of energy like electromagnetism, trying to affect somebody 1,000 miles away, the energy is dissipated. You have very little energy that actually can get from here to a distant person. But with a four-dimensional focusing, as I describe here, it actually makes sense to do that. This model can explain why it is, how it is, that a healer can reach his hand into a person, as some Philippine healers do. It explains why the brainwave frequencies correspond to the auric layers of the body. It explains, it offers a model for the Akashic record. These torsion waves actually can explain how memory and events can be stored in the distant matter of the universe and how we can actually access it and recover it. And it's a model for origin of consciousness. So I think I'm going to pull it together and close up at this point. As you might imagine, when a person becomes more adept at affecting distant matter and these vibrations and these parallel realities, it's possible to cause bigger and bigger distortions. Normally, someone who is not trained very well, not very disciplined, can cause small effects. Adepts and people who have strong abilities can cause very large effects. And I talk about that in the model as well. So there's kind of a hierarchy from the novice to the adept in terms of the ability to cause changes in external reality. So I'll just conclude by saying Bob Monroe was right. We're more than our physical bodies. And as Victor Hugo said, all of the armies of the world are not as powerful as an idea whose time has come. So thank you very much.